These are the primary building blocks of what will come in future weeks, about the operation of these systems and about the development of proposals for constitutional reform, which will meet later this term and next term. But this week it is indeed the evolution of the state and the constitution. Martin Lachlan.
Thank you very much, Tony. What you have up there on the slide is an overview of what it is I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the concept of the state and the constitution in the British system of government, and then explain why these concepts are difficult concepts for us, and they are difficult concepts for us because of the peculiar evolution of our governmental arrangements, and I'll try to explain why and take you through this different understanding of what a constitution is, why the British Constitution takes the form that it does, and what implications there are for thinking about contemporary questions from the perspective of that historical survey. I am going to give you a legal analysis. It will not be a technical analysis, but I assume most of you are students of government, and British political science has for far too long ignored law. Law is absolutely essential. You can't understand British government, the British Constitution, without understanding its legal foundation. So that's what I have to convince you of this evening. Let me start with the state. In German state theory, great 19th century German state theory, the jurists developed a legal concept of the state that had three key aspects. And these were dimensions of or aspects of the state. One is, they say, the state is the territory. We understand the state as a territory when we look at a map of the world and we see the world, the landmass of the world, divided up into territories with different colors on the map. And those different territories we call states. So in that sense, we might focus on the state as the territory, a particular territorial jurisdiction. That's one aspect of the state. Staatsgebiet, for those who are interested in the German. The second aspect of the state is the people. It's the people who live in that defined territory, and they define themselves as a collectivity, a unity. They are formed into a particular type of political association, a bond, and that group of people, Staatsvolk, is the state. That might seem a slightly more unusual use of the state, but when you think of all modern constitutions that are drafted, they invariably start with what? We, the people, do ordain and establish this constitutional structure, this system of government. We, the people is the highest form of authority, the ultimate source of power. And it's in that sense that we, the people, singular, collective singular, is the state. And the third element of the state is the state as the apparatus of governmental authority, the apparatus of rule. When I say government, I don't mean the government as distinct from the parliament or the courts or any other public officials. I mean the office of government, the whole structure of official rule. And that idea of the office of government, the institutional form that through which political power is exercised, is a third element of the state, what the Germans call Staatsgewalt, the power of the state. And political scientists, when they talk about the state, they invariably are talking about that third element only. So when Ralph Miliband writes his The State in Capitalist Society, he means Staatsgewalt, he means that third element of the state. And that's how, when you see all these self-styled radical political scientists talking about the state, that's what they mean. But for us, more profound thinkers, that is the lawyers, these are just three aspects of the state. The state is actually an idea. It's the founding idea that builds this entire world through which we conceive ourselves to be a self-governing association where power rests ultimately with an entity called the people within a defined territory who construct a system of government in which the authority of that structure of government is total. They owe no legal obedience to any institution outside of that state. So, in legal thought, the state is the fundamental idea that makes sense of this entire way of looking at the world. The way of looking at the world that is political, but at the same time also legal, because it constitutes legal authority. Now, for reasons I'll come on to explain, the British do not have a coherent legal concept of the state, unlike most jurisdictions in the world. And the nearest that we get to a concept of the state in legal thought in Britain is the concept of the crown. And I'll come back and explain that. But just think for the moment, I talked about the state as the apparatus of rule. Well, what are the basic building blocks of that? The first is we have a parliament down the road. It meets where? In a royal palace. And it is opened by edict of the Queen, and it is dissolved by order of the Queen. And the government obtains its commission by order of the Queen. They are Her Majesty's ministers. And the judges receive their commission. They become judges by order of the Queen. They are Her Majesty's judges. So we have a structure in which the pivot that makes the system work is this concept of, it's not the Queen, it's the crown. It's the monarch in its political capacity. And it's that concept of the crown that is the nearest that we have in law in the British system to this concept of the state. Come back to it. That's all I want to say by way of introduction. Let me come on and say, why is it that way? The answer lies in British constitutional history. So let me come to constitutions. And to start by saying that we first need to recognize that there are two there are more than two, but for our purposes, two different fundamental ideas of a constitution, an ancient and a modern idea of a constitution. And we need to be aware of that distinction in order to understand how and whether Britain has a constitution. So I start with the great Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who writes in 1830 in his great work, The Philosophy of Mind, or The Philosophy of Spirit, this: what is called making a constitution, he says, is a thing that has never happened in history. It's never happened. Why? Because you can't make a constitution. A constitution is something that evolves through, well, Hegel's using a very Germanic idea, through a national spirit, through a culture, through a way of being of a people that understand themselves as a people, as a singular people first. We English, and I mean English at this point, we English think of ourselves as forming a nation. And the way we understand our habits and our practices and our way of political being is our constitution. And that, says Hegel, is the real meaning of a constitution. How we understand this sense of a unity of a people. This is the ancient idea of a constitution. It can no more be made than language is made. Language evolves through customary usage. So too does a constitution. Now we might say, in retrospect, we might say that Hegel was wrong. He was writing that in the 1830s. Whereas we reel back a few decades to 1787, we come to one of the great works of American constitutional thought, the Federalist Papers, the papers written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay, who were involved in the drafting of the world's first modern written constitution, the Constitution of the Federal Republic of the United States. And they are trying to convince the electorate of New York why they should ratify this new constitution. And Hamilton, in the first of the Federalist Papers, says this: "It has been reserved to the people of this country to determine an important question. And that important question is whether or not societies of men," he means people, "societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government through reflection and choice, or whether they are forever dependent for their political constitutions on accident and force." And we might say that the Americans gave us the first of the modern type of constitution. And for Hamilton and his associates, this is not just a different type of constitution, it's a real constitution, not like those ancient ones. Because where Hegel is talking about culture and national spirit, Hamilton is saying accident and force. These ancient constitutions are mechanisms that justify the unjustifiable. Power conferred on a hereditary basis. And these new modern constitutions are seeking to create a structure of government through reflection, through deliberation, through choice, through consent. We, the people, ordain this system, this constitution. And the thing about modern constitutions is that first, they are constructions. They are something that are made. So if you're not British, and I ask, do you have a constitution? You say, yes, we've got a constitution. Where is it? You hold up a piece of paper, a document. You say, this is the constitution. This is our constitution. It's drafted at a particular moment in time, and it's a text. And this is where the lawyers get in on the game. And the lawyers say, look, we are the skilled interpreters of the meanings of text. So the great third innovation of the American creation of a modern type of constitution is to say, not only is it constructed, it is a device, and not only is it written down in words, it is fundamental law. What do we mean by fundamental law? Is that a constitution establishes the institutions of government, including the legislature, the institution that has the power to make law. But the legislature just makes ordinary law, the law that regulates the social collisions that take place in life. So it will pass laws that lay down a criminal code or a code for compensation for accidents that might occur, or an arrangement whereby we contract with one another to reach a mutually agreeable and legally enforceable bargain, a contract. But that's ordinary law. Behind the ordinary law made by the ordinary legislature is a body of law that makes the legislature, that makes the government, that makes the judiciary. This is the constitutional law. It's fundamental law, or to change the metaphor slightly, there's a hierarchy of laws. Ordinary laws are made by the legislature. Constitutional law is the law of the Constitution that establishes the authority, the lawmaking authority of the legislature. So we have a different species of law here. We have the ordinary law and then higher law. And I labor that point, and I labor the modern idea of a constitution and talk about its constituent elements for a simple reason. We do not in Britain have a modern type of constitution. There is no drafting of a foundational text at a particular moment in time that takes effect as fundamental law. And so even in the 1830s, we have Alexis de Tocqueville writing in his classic work, Democracy in America, this statement: in England, he means Britain, in England, the Constitution may change continually. But then he goes on to say, or in reality, it does not exist. That is, he's already accepted by the 1830s the idea that a constitution is only of the modern type. If you don't have a modern type of constitution, you don't have a constitution. He's not acknowledging that the ancient sense of a constitution is a real constitution. So he's saying the British don't have a constitution. The reason why, that's a rather profound clause afterwards. Parliament is at once a legislature and a constituent assembly. What he's saying is that our legislature, the Parliament, makes the ordinary laws, in the sense I've just distinguished ordinary and fundamental law, but at the same time, by the ordinary process of legislation, it can fundamentally change the governmental order of the state. So we pass a Theft Act or a Contract Unfair Terms Act, ordinary legislation, but we might also pass a European Union Act, hypothetical, because whereby we join and give governmental power to a new entity, or we pass Parliament Acts that change the way in which bills become acts, or we pass a Human Rights Act that says that all public agencies must respect these basic principles laid out in the European Convention on Human Rights that protect the basic charter of civil and political rights, all of which are changing the constitutional form of the state, but it's all done by ordinary legislation. So there's no hierarchy of laws, there's no sense of fundamental law, there's just the highest form of law is the Act of Parliament, and you can't differentiate whether Parliament is acting as a legislature or as a constituent assembly. The constituent assembly is that special convention that is assembled as a meeting of the people to draft a new constitution. And that reflects the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. Right, let me come back. I'll continue, but bring back the point about the state. Although Britain does not have a modern type of constitution, the British practices have been looked upon with envy and celebrated through history as being the cradle in which we think about constitutional government. How did this come about? Well, very early on in English constitutional development, we see a conceptual distinction being drawn between the king and the crown. Even by the 13th century, the English kings were pledged by the coronation oath to maintain the rights of the crown. Now, you've got a king who is obliged to maintain the rights of the crown. There's clearly something called, there's some notion of a crown that stands as a representation of something or a symbol of something that is different from the person of the king. And here, I can't, everybody's going to be going on, they've already started up, but in a few months' time, they'll be going on and on and on about 800th anniversary of Magna Carta. God. No one understands what Magna Carta was about unless you are a skilled medieval historian. Try go up the British Library and read the document. It doesn't make any sense unless you really have studied Holt's text and have an intimate understanding of the land law of the period and the structure of government of the period. But never mind that. The importance of Magna Carta for our purposes is that King John engaged in foreign wars unsuccessfully, ruined his state, his standing, his status, because he hasn't got any money, and he has to be reined in by the barons, and he's reined in by the barons who force him to sign this great charter. And what Magna Carta does is to say that we are circumscribing the personal power of the king in order to bolster the office of the crown. And the reason, the way in which we do that, rather, is by institutionalizing this office of the crown. And we say the king can speak as king only through his council. So the barons are saying the king speaks as king only when the king has met with his council and deliberated, and then we speak authoritatively as the royal will. So we curb arbitrary personal power, we institutionalize that power. And there are mechanisms by which we do it. We have a Lord Chancellor, still today, a Lord Chancellor, who holds the Great Seal of State. We have a Lord Privy Seal, who holds the King's, Queen's private seal. And unless the will of the king is attested by the seal held by another officer of state, then the king's will is not authentically presented. So we institutionalize. That's the great achievement of Magna Carta. And then, so we have a sense that the king, the authority of the state is expressed through the king in council. And there comes a moment where there are very important matters of state that have to be determined. And in order to determine these matters of state, we convene a meeting of the Great Council. And the meeting of the Great Council is a demand sent out in the name of the king that the 40 counties of England, the 40 shires, send 2 of their representatives to meet with the king in council, in the great council of the nation, to determine these really vitally important issues of state. They're not going to determine them. There's no democracy here. It's to bind all of the parts of the nation to the project. And the project, you know, is going to be an expensive one. The king needs more revenue, and the king needs to tax. And in order to tax, you want to bind everyone to... this is the community of the realm meeting, the state meeting in this great council. And this is the origin of the Parliament. It's not some great democratic movement. It's a means of binding the nation together. It's top-down authority. Send us 2 representatives so you're bound to accede to this project. But there we get the origins of the Parliament. And the Parliament is not, don't think of the Parliament here as the House of Commons, constituency representatives, democratic. The king in council, in Parliament, is the state. And it's state sovereignty. When the king in council, in parliament, determines something, then it's the state, the nation assembled, speaking. And that's why it has absolute authority. And the moment at which we see this fundamentally expressed is in the moment of the Reformation. Why? Because during the Middle Ages, we have a regime, a feudal regime, where many powerful entities, let's just call them entities, have special privileges and special immunities from the ordinary processes of law. And the institution that has the greatest privileges and the greatest immunities is the church. The church is a great landowner, a very powerful secular institution with its own court structure, with its line of authority that takes you, hierarchical line of authority through the bishops to Rome. And never mind the circumstances, haven't time or the interest to go into that. What Henry does at the moment of the Reformation is to cut off any line of authority to the church in Rome and says, I am the absolute ruler. My will is law. There is no other institution in the land that can challenge my authority. And he destroys the jurisdictional authority of the church. And he makes himself head of the church, just to reinforce the point. But, and I've given you this quotation from Henry, comes to Parliament and he says, we stand never so high in our royal estate, feudal, status, standing, state, modern, political association. We at no time stand so highly in our royal estate as in time of Parliament, wherein we, he means me, I mean, not me, he, the king, whereas we, the royal we as head, and you, the members of Parliament, literally as members, are united in one body politic. The body politic is the corporeal form of the state. By the body politic we mean the state, and the state expresses its will when the Crown in Council meets in Parliament. Another feature of modern constitutions, these modern liberal democratic constitutional forms, is they're built on the notion of a separation of powers. And crazily, Montesquieu, who's supposed to be the originator of this wonderful idea, studies the Constitution. If you look at the Spirit of the Laws, it's the chapter in which he talks about the Constitution of England, is the chapter in which he says, the English have the separation of powers, and that's the modern form of constitutional government, and that's what we should aspire to. We do not. We have a complex, multi-layered, integrated structure of authority. The Crown in Council, in Parliament. The Crown in Council is the Privy Council, still exists. You can tell if any of these leading politicians are Privy Councillors because they have PC written after their name. And it's not just ministers, but also senior judges will be Privy Councillors. But the Privy Council, that idea of the crowning council, is also the origins of our system of cabinet government. Members of the cabinet, the principal secretaries of state, meeting with the Prime Minister to form the policy of the government, they'll invariably be Privy Councillors. And there are certain legal powers that they exercise through order in council. These are orders of the Privy Council. But the point I'm trying to get to is that these councillors can only be councillors if they're members of Parliament. In Barack Obama's first term, he wanted to appoint Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary in our language. Hillary Clinton at that time was Senator for New York, member of the Congress. She can't be Secretary of State and a member of the Senate. So she has to resign her senatorial position in order to take on the office of the Secretary of State. That's the separation of powers. In our system, you can't be a member of the government unless you're a member of one or other of the Houses of Parliament. It's an integrated structure. The council is embedded in the Parliament. And if somebody wants to appoint some business person as a minister, as has happened, Digby, whatever you call it, Digby Jones was going to be some minister in business in, it was a Labour government, wasn't it? Gordon Brown's government. Thank you, Tony. He just, he was the Director General of the CBI or something of that sort. How do you do it? He's not elected. You just make him a peer of the realm, stick him in the House of Lords, and then he can become a minister. But he has to be in one or other of these Houses of Parliament in order to be a minister. Different arrangement altogether. Now, I emphasize that because that's our heritage, that's our structure, and that explains why, it doesn't fully explain, but it goes some of the way down the road to explaining why the central pivotal concept in that history is the concept of the crown, the monarch in her public capacity, the monarch as a symbol of the authority of the state. So when the crowning council in Parliament passes an act of Parliament, that is the highest form of law. When the crowning council meets and makes an order of council, that is a special type of law. When the judges, Her Majesty's judges, make judgments, that too is a making of a special type of law, though they pretend that they're declaring rather than making law. But the entire edifice is organized around this entity of the crown, which, as I say, is the nearest we have to a legal symbol of the state. Back to constitution. Why then do we not have a modern concept of the state, a legal concept of the state in the way that many states do? The answer lies in the peculiarities of our constitutional development. And the main reason why we don't have a modern constitution is because when we think about it, the modern constitutions come about as a consequence of Enlightenment thinking. That is the rationalizing, scientific, secular, intellectual movement that flourished in Europe during the 18th century. And it sees its political expression in the late 18th century in the American and the French revolutions. And it's only after those late 18th century revolutions do we start conceiving ourselves as a people that has the authority, the capacity, the power to make a constitution, to establish by our reflection and deliberation the order of government under which we live. And thereafter, nation states across the world have, at various points in history, made for themselves a modern type of constitution. When that comes about and how that comes about is a product of the particular circumstances of their own historical development. Sometimes it's because of the utter collapse of authority of a state, say because of defeat in a major war, as in Germany, end of the First World War, Kaiser abdicates, entire loss of the authority structure, attempt to reconstruct authority through a modern social democratic republic, the Weimar Republic. Sometimes it's a consequence of the breakdown of empires because it's only in the 19th century, 19th to the 20th century, you see the rise of nation-state principle. The world is a world of empires largely before then, but when you have the collapse and corrosion of these empires, you have nation-states born within the bowels of the disintegrated imperial form. So you get the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you have the formation of nation-states that have this moment at which they renew themselves through constitutions. Sometimes it's an insurrectionary movement, a revolutionary overthrow of the old regime. Whatever the reason, sometimes it's a general decolonization process through negotiation rather than collapse. Circumstances are different. But the problem, if it is a problem for us in Britain, is that we have had no fundamental rupture in the authority structure of our state since the late 18th century. And I like to say at this point that it's because we British are peaceable people who don't have revolutionary insurrection. Wrong, of course. We were so rebellious, we had our revolutions too early. We had them in the 17th century, not in the 18th century. And we did a dramatic thing that was unprecedented in European history. We chopped off the head of a king, and we tried to create a republic. It was called the Commonwealth. The problem was we couldn't conceive of authority at that time without a central figurehead that would provide the symbol of order and stability. And so, after a couple of years of the Commonwealth, we asked Oliver Cromwell to become the Lord Protector. And indeed, some asked Cromwell to become king. But the protectorate was held together by the personality of Cromwell. When Cromwell dies, there's a loss of confidence in the authority structure, and a couple of years later we invite Charles II, we invite Charles II, Charles I's son, who was off in exile in France, to come back, and we restore the monarchy. And we try to restore the old constitution and pretend that that period never actually happened. We wipe it out of legal history. But even so, there have been rather significant changes to the composition of the state since the 17th century. What's the name of this state we live in? Not a rhetorical question. What do we call this state of which I'm a citizen? The United Kingdom. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. How does it come to be called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Well, you start out with an English state, Norman conquest and all that. Normans come over, win the crown by battle, trial by battle. They centralize authority very early, ruthlessly, and it is a conquest, absolutely no doubt about that. And they then do what all rulers wanting to strengthen and stabilize their regime need to do, and that is to suppress the weaker surrounding nations as much as anything, because the Normans had continental territories too and ambitious projects to pursue on the continent of Europe, and they certainly didn't want to be engaged in those campaigns with the possibility of the Welsh or the Scots or the Irish coming and forming an alliance with the French to fight on having to fight on two fronts. So they subjugate these weaker nations. The Welsh brutally just go to Wales. Go and have a look at Harlech Castle or Carnarvon Castle or Conway Castle, wherever. You see the big Norman castles designed to institutionalize English rule throughout the Welsh lands. And Wales is annexed and absorbed into the English state. So in law, we talk about the English common law. It's the law applying in England and Wales. And Wales is just brought into the structure of the English state. It's a process that's complete by the Statute of Wales in 1535. So the English state becomes England and Wales. The territory is England and Wales. We form the state of Great Britain not by conquest but by treaty. Treaty of Union of 1707 brings the Scots into a union with England to form the state of Great Britain. It's 5-6. I am not going to go into the history of that. It was well, let me just say, of course, remember, we had a union of the crowns since 1603, when James VI of Scotland, Elizabeth, the end of the Tudor period, Elizabeth dies. James VI of Scotland becomes James the first of England. So throughout the 17th century, we have a union of the crowns. We then form the state of Great Britain. Ireland is an even more complicated story, but we, the English for this purpose, I'm of Irish ancestry, but I'm English for this purpose. I am English. I'm British. The Irish are subjugated for many centuries without them being absorbed into the structure of the legal structure of the English state. They have their own parliament, but for a variety of reasons, by the end of the 18th century, it's felt essential formally to incorporate Ireland within the state of Great Britain. And in the Treaty of Union of 1801, the Irish state is absorbed into the British state, and we form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and then the Irish throughout the 19th century seek to promote home rule, Catholic emancipation and then home rule. And of course, then you have First World War, Easter Rising, home rule conceded, civil war in Ireland, seeking their independence, and eventually in the 1920s, they break from the United Kingdom to form the Republic of Ireland. But the 6 counties in the northeast of the island of Ireland, with the Protestant majority, mainly through Scottish plantation, are unionists. They want to stay part of the British state, and Ireland is partitioned. So we get the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So we get a complex, multinational, changing composition of a state, but through all of those changes, we never have the fundamental moment at which we say we need to reconstitute ourselves as a nation state and have the comprehensive new constitutional settlement. The Scots might have given us this last month, because if the Scots had voted for independence, the interesting consequence would be, what does the remainder of the United Kingdom look like? And is that a moment at which we would need to deal with some constitutional fundamentals that we've managed to avoid for a long, long time? Even so, I think with devolutionary schemes, of course, we gave the Scots their own parliament in Edinburgh under the Scotland Act of 1998. With a devolutionary scheme, I'll not go into the technicalities, but happy to address that at any point if you want me to. But now that all the major parties are signed up to some inchoate notion called Devo Plus, then I do wonder whether or not we're able to achieve that without asking ourselves a lot of more basic questions about how the whole constitution of the state of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is organized. I say the main reason we do not have a modern constitution in Britain is because of that history. But there is something also in the English temperament, and indeed British temperament, that reinforces this ancient traditional idea of constitutional ordering. And the easiest way of bringing this out is by going to the great English political philosopher of the 20th century, Michael Oakeshott. And Oakeshott, in his essay Rationalism in Politics, draws a distinction between 2 types of knowledge. I'm presenting it very crudely, but Oakeshott's saying, look, he's making an epistemological point. How do we know what we know? And he's saying the problem is that today we scholars tend to be seduced by rationalism, and we are thinking that the only type of knowledge that exists is scientific knowledge. This scientific knowledge is the sort of knowledge that can be taught and learned? You're puzzled. Right. It's the sort of knowledge that's laid down in books that you come to university to study, and you learn the knowledge that you find in books. The epitome of scientific knowledge is mathematical knowledge. We try to understand the world by reducing it to a series of laws, and I don't mean my type of laws, scientific laws. Rules for understanding how the world works. And so the mathematicians imagine the entire world as a numerical system. It's a bit more complicated than that, but I don't know how to express it because I'm not a mathematician. But they build their very fancy equations and algorithms, and they construct a way of understanding the world and of enabling us to conquer that world. And in this institution, the mathematicians have taken over the economics department. And they build their algorithms for making the financial world work. Till it's so complicated, nobody understands how it works. And it's all fine because everybody's making money till some little glitch in the system kicks off and the whole world. Anyway, I'm getting off the point. The point is that there is a sense of scientific knowledge that can be susceptible to precise formulation. 2 + 2 = 4. We reduce the world to law-like behavior. But Oakeshott says there's another type of knowledge that he wants to call practical knowledge. This is knowledge that can't be taught and learned in that way. It can only be imparted and acquired by the participants engaging in the activity. It is acquired through experience. And the simple illustration he gives us is cookery. How do we learn what it is to be a good cook? And the answer he wants us to think about is that we learn it through being apprenticed in a kitchen to somebody who is a skilled master chef who really understands the art of cooking. And I once watched a weird, wonderful Japanese film about sushi and how the apprentices were in there for 2 or 3 years and they were not allowed, they just watched the master cutting the fish. They occasionally were allowed to chop a couple but take it easy. You have to imbibe this knowledge. And, to extend the analogy, if I assume that cooking is a form of scientific knowledge, then I'm going to say to myself, look, I'm an intelligent guy, I can read. Walk across the road to the bookshop there, buy the Cordon Bleu cookbook, break it open at page 80. On the left-hand side, there's a color picture of a beautiful dish. On the right-hand side, there's 10 easy steps for how you make that dish. And I just follow the instructions. I stick it in the oven. I wait the 22 minutes that it tells me to, and I pull it out of the oven and I look at it, and it doesn't look anything like the picture. And it doesn't look anything like the picture because I've misunderstood the nature of the activity I was embarked on, and I've misunderstood the source of knowledge. The cookbook is only a crib. It's a crib that can be used by somebody who already has the practical knowledge of what it is to be a good cook. The error I've made is what Oakeshott calls the error of rationalism, of assuming that all knowledge is reducible to scientific knowledge. Now you might think I'm off on some wild, circuitous route here, but there is a point to what I'm saying. If you know anything, and you don't, none of you are lawyers, are they? No. If you know anything about the English legal system, you know it's a system of common law. And then I might ask you, well, what does common law mean? And what we mean by the common law, now I'm showing how fancy I am because I'm going to give you a Latin tag. It's lex non scripta. Unwritten law. The source of the knowledge of the common law is not to be found in books. The source of the knowledge is found in experience. And let me explain that. Traditionally, we have never taught English law in the universities. Why? Because it's not a fit subject for scientific study. The young gentlemen who wanted to become skilled legal practitioners went to the great public schools of England, and they went from the great public schools of England to the Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and they studied there mathematics or natural sciences or the classics, and only on graduation did they come here across the road from Lincoln's Inn Fields to Lincoln's Inn, where they were apprenticed to a pupil master, to a barrister who was already a skilled advocate, and they spent years apprenticed to that advocate, learning the art of pleading, drafting, how to read a case, how to present a case. And through that immersion, through that experience, they acquired the knowledge of the common law. And then they practiced at the bar for 20 or 30 years and built up a practice through experience, and then they were appointed High Court judges. Not for us a career judiciary, as is the case in continental Europe. Our judges become judges only because they have already acquired that experience of the workings of the common law. They were the unfortunate ones. Some of those barristers, if they were the elder sons, inherited the title, and they became members of the House of Lords. And if they were a bit less fortunate, the younger sons, they would just inherit the constituency. And they would come to represent their constituency in the House of Commons. And you get what the great 19th century political commentator Walter Bagehot calls club government. When you have government by a club, where they're all educated in the same traditions of of understanding appropriate behavior, you don't have to write any of this down. If you're in a club where everybody understands what the culture of the club is, you don't need to write all the rules down. You don't need to write a constitution. It's built there in the makeup of the ruling authority, the ruling class. The problem is, in the 20th century, we see the rise of democracy, the rise of rationalist politics, ideological politics, politics organized in accordance with disciplined political parties, who do not owe their allegiance to the conventional understandings of how we exercise governmental power. They owe it to their party. And so we have the problem today in the British system in which we've got an ancient constitution or a traditional constitution or an aristocratic constitution or a constitution built on the precepts of club government, built on practical knowledge and experience, but we have a political system that is thoroughly ideological. It doesn't matter what your ideology is. It doesn't matter whether it's from each according to their ability to each according to their needs, or the objective is to promote the greatest happiness of the greatest number. The fact is, it is politics by rule book. It's rationalist politics, says Oakeshott. And the problem we're living with is that sense that the traditional constitution is losing its authority because we no longer imbibe and acquire and accept the conventions of rule in accordance with that evolutionary arrangement. And we're constantly having to build to formalize conventions. And we see this in the recent dissipation of the authority, the status of the House of Commons. Everything from the cash for questions to the whole expenses scandal. Sure, there's no rule that says you're not supposed to take cash for asking questions, but if you've been educated in the conventional understanding of what is appropriate conduct of a member of Parliament, you would know that you don't do that. You don't have to have it written down. And because people are there who don't seem to understand and accept that any longer, you have to write all these things down. And we've spent the last 20 or 30 years trying to codify, writing these codes of appropriate conduct. So now we used to have a little document that was secret and never published called Questions of Procedure for Ministers, and then it became public in the 80s, and now it's the whole, what's it called? The whole it's called the Ministerial Code. And it's a 120-page document saying, do this, don't do that. Or if you want to do that, go through this procedure. None of this was written down before. It didn't have to be written down because of, well, I'm not going to make any assumptions. I'm saying it is now all written down, but we're sort of propping up a constitutional order that is just imploding on itself. And I don't know the answer, because that's why I'm here. There you go. I am finished.
Very good. Thank you very much. Excellent. Massive tour d'horizon there, large horizontal tour, actually. Jimmy. There you are. You're on first. A microphone at the back there, I think. So my eye line took you the wrong place. My fault.
You talked about this tension that we now have between sort of rationalist politics and the fact that we still have traditional constitutional structure. I'm wondering, since, as you mentioned, in the last 20 or 30 years, there have been attempts to sort of codify parliamentary practice, but also sort of on a grander scale, what the Labour government of 1997
sure.
has been doing with attempts at law reform,
yeah.
Human Rights Act, or
Sure.
whatever. Would you say that part of these pressures for there to be a codified constitution is not only due to MPs who maybe don't understand parliamentary procedure, but rather to actually popular pressure from the electorate to have a more sort of rationalist system, shall we say?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and a very good observation, and you're absolutely correct. It's not just a bundle of cronies who are in government who are venal and don't understand appropriate conduct. It's a product of a whole series of social, economic, cultural changes that have taken place, technological changes also, so that we now, politicians now live in the glare of the 24-hour media intrusion, and we are more demanding of what our elected representatives are doing in our name, and through certain channels at least are determined to hold them to account. You're also right in terms of the Labour government project, because the Blair government project could be called a project of constitutional modernisation. It was seeking to modernise the constitution. It came into power in 1997 and it passed very quickly House of Lords reform. Well, it's in a sorry state of affairs, but it was supposed to be the first stage of a reform of the second chamber to make it more legitimate by getting rid of the right of hereditary peers to sit in the second chamber. Ironically, now the only elected element of the second chamber, the hereditary peers, the 93 of them who are elected from the 600 also previously had the right to attend. But there's House of Lords reform, there's the devolution schemes in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland under those three acts in 1998. There's the Human Rights Act of 1998 that comes into effect in 2000. There's also the Freedom of Information Act. So there's a series of reforms that are trying to change the structure of government and to create a more open and accessible structure of government for us. So it's a product of a series of changes. And also, do not underestimate the importance of growing integration into the European network. And I don't just mean the European Union, I also mean the Council of Europe. When you look at a reform like the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, what the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005 does is to say our highest court, the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, can no longer sit as a committee of the second chamber. And therefore, at great expense, we have to take these law lords out of the Palace of Westminster and stick them across the road in the other corner of Westminster Square.
Parliament Square.
Parliament Square, thank you, Tony. And call them a Supreme Court, is because we lack confidence in our own traditions. There was no mischief, there was no problem. The House of Lords, the law lords, because they were formerly peers of the realm and members of the second chamber, were not acting improperly. There were conventions that they complied with as to the manner in which they acted. But we couldn't explain this to the rest of the world, and all these other countries were acceding to joining the Council of Europe and signing up to the post-communist countries were saying, well, Britain has judges who are part of the executive, so why can't we? And it's just a lack of confidence in our own traditions and the need to rationalize, harmonize, render the template more conducive to understanding in terms of a liberal democratic regime built on a separation of powers, that we create a reform that, at one level or other, looks as though it's really quite cosmetic, but will have profound symbolic importance. not just at home but also abroad.
Yeah, question at the front here.
Regarding the use of the language of Queen, opening up the Parliament, I'm going to just call out the Church. I think it makes more sense in my own mind as a member of the public. So with the Church opening up Parliament and having such control and symbolistic control, and with this regarding the club government, I feel that this is still a system which is very dominant today in our society. And I call that the ecosystem, standing for Eton, Cambridge. So, slight change of language there. But the eco is combined with the church and with their authority over what people call government. How can we say that we live in a democracy when they have such unelected power? How can we, and if we do not live in a democracy, would you agree with that?
Okay. Okay, well, keep it. It's a great question. I'm not trying to stop you clapping. It's just that last time we got in trouble for being in here at 6:30, so Martin, you'll have to answer relatively swiftly, I'm afraid. I got in trouble, my fault.
I thought I went out of my way to give an entire presentation that hardly mentioned the word democracy. I didn't say anything about Britain being a democracy. I talked about the evolution of a top-down structure of authority where rule, as states are created in Britain, as they are in every regime, top-down. And there's a struggle by the, what shall I call them? Hobbes would call them the crowd. The masses. No, I mean the ordinary people.
Proletariat.
You could say the proletariat, but in Britain we don't make anything any longer, so lumpen proletariat probably. But there's a continuous struggle about thought I was trying to say, look, don't assume that parliamentary sovereignty expresses a democratic value. There is a democratic element to it, but the parliament is constituted in a particular way, and even the members of the elected members of parliament are only one of the three component parts of that structure of the crown in parliament that makes law. Democracy is not my bag. I'm into the business of understanding government.
Hang on. No, keep going, but I mean, we're going to have to stop in a second.
It was a personal question then. Do you believe we live in a democracy?
I don't understand what democracy means in the world today, because throughout the world we talk about democracies, but every form of democracy that exists in the world is one of representative democracy. And representative government comes about from the medieval period, and it's an aristocratic form of government. So the only form of government that we know in the world, representative democracy, is an aristocratic, is a structure of government that is an aristocracy. There is a political elite in every system that rules. And there is a democratic element, Schumpeterian element, where you have an election between the political elites. One of the great cases in the United States Supreme Court in the last 20 years was Bush v. Gore, where the Supreme Court effectively decided who won the 2000 presidential election. The interesting fact, the point in Bush v. Gore, is that you have the son of a former president challenging the son of a former senator for the office of the presidency. That's an elite system perpetuating itself. Do I think it could be different? I have no idea. I'm just a lawyer.
Okay, we better stop there, Martin, because otherwise the next there'll be people piled outside.
Okay.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. I don't want to overrun. Next week we'll be hearing about the development of the modern British government, which we'll be building on this week, and that's with Professor Alan Sked. So this time next week. See you all then. Thank you very much. And for those on GV311, the lecture capture ought to be available, I hope, tomorrow sometime, and certainly by Thursday, for those of you who are looking for it.